Tell me more about the work you do, because it's fascinating. We've sort of crossed paths because of the whole refugee interest, but you've been doing this for a very, very long time now, like 5 years or more.
Yeah, well, I'm actually, I like to create physical spaces. And, I wasn't intending ever to get involved with refugee affairs. I was really just on a quest to learn about how do you create a space that people feel like it's their own, and that you get kind of participation, engagement, civic engagement. And that kind of just led me on this path to try this in different situations and countries all over the world, and looking somehow to do it in more and more complicated places to see if these universal principles of creating space that people feel like is their own can be applied to these complex situations, and that they're all the same. So I kind of call myself like a pretend humanitarian. Even though it's certainly the field I'm in, I feel like I'm just someone who's trying to, create agency, really. I think there's a big challenge in the world with agency. I've heard it called agency deprivation disorder, that there's a big, people don't believe that they have the ability to control the situation that they're in. And so you get a lot of apathy. And so, yeah, I'm really just trying to use physical space in a way to let people, feel empowered and realize their own collective potential.
Yeah, just translating agency here for the teenager audience is the ability you have to get things done, right? It's the opposite of what's called the learned helplessness, where you believe that you're useless, that you don't have the skills, that it's a waste of time, there's no point in doing something, and you become helpless, not because you don't have the agency potential, but because you learn that being helpless suits your occasion. And it's usually a one-way path towards a very miserable life. So I'm very happy that you're helping people enhance their understanding of their capabilities and potential as well.
Yeah.
Well, how did you get there? Like, what is the background story when you describe yourself as an applied geographer in your LinkedIn profile, which is why I couldn't find you and didn't realize it was you?
Well, yeah, I have trouble putting a title on what I do, but essentially, I just show up places. When I see that there's a natural disaster, I like to go and find out what the conditions are and how we could rebuild. When there's a refugee crisis, I like to show up. And, it's very rare that people go to these places that aren't paid to go or part of a larger organization. But I found that the freedom to be able to show up to these places, meet people, find out, from them what's going on is really been impactful in my own life personally. And hopefully that's translated into some impact to the communities that I serve. And, the two things that kind of came up for me as you kind of posed this question of how I got here and what are some kind of shortcuts or decisions I've made in my life that helped me get here. The first thing I thought of was, one, try and do something that no one else is doing. And the way I do that so often is by fusing together passions of mine that are things that, make me, unique. The word amateur is kind of thought of as not good or poor quality. But really, the word amateur comes from the root word to love. And if you're doing something because you love it, not because it's for money, that's actually often you're going to be better at that than someone else who's doing it for money. And the first story that kind of came up to me was when I was in high school. There was my group of friends wanted to make a band, and there were like 6 people who all played guitar. And I'm not very musically talented, but what I did is I went out and got a bass. And because the band needed a bass, I actually made the band, even though I was probably the least musically talented. And, but that kind of showed me that instead of following what everyone else is doing, to kind of go your own path and that kind of makes you, the best at what you're doing. And I think that's been a theme of a lot of my life, in that, I make careers up. Like I was the director of sustainability at a nightclub. I was the only one in the world who was doing that. So I was, world class at that, essentially. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the themes, is how can you do something that is, exciting to you, and that's really unique. And then again, you become like the world expert because there's no competition. But the world needs creative ideas and passion.
So, and what is the story with Uganda? I mean, what led you there?
Well, so maybe I'll share a couple of images here. So, I used to work at Yahoo. Yahoo was the largest website at the time. And, I really wasn't very passionate about it. And I kind of had this awakening. I heard this story of someone telling me about, this person who would jump off their haystack in the morning to get to work. And I kind of got really emotional realizing that I hated going to work. And I needed to kind of change my life to be able to get up and be excited about what I was about to do that day. And so some friends of mine got a building in San Francisco, and they were going to make a new nightclub. And I was passionate about the environment. And, this was back in like 2006, 2007, when the green movement was just starting. And so what we did is we made it an environmental nightclub. We had an energy generating dance floor, rooftop beehives, greenhouse worms, and we did all this conservation of water, energy, and waste. But really what was the most impactful is we let people use our space for free. And that was, I realized that was, but by allowing people to use our space for something that they were passionate about was really the most impactful thing. And you got to really witness trends of what other people were passionate about. And, a few years later, I came up with a concept with some of my friends in San Francisco called Freespace. And we rented this building in San Francisco for $1 for the month of June. And usually the building was for rent for $26,000 a month, but we convinced the landlord to let us use it for $1 because they weren't using it anyway. And it was this kind of ugly, abandoned building. And we invited artists to come paint on the walls. The inside was this kind of boring, abandoned warehouse. And within 11 days, we kind of transferred it into this whole thing where murals were painted and a slide was bought. And we wound up doing 119 events in our first 30 days. And so that was really this exciting moment of seeing how much excitement could come around a space when you just kind of, again, give people permission, or this term we used before, agency, that it was theirs. And we started getting inquiries from all over the world to kind of recreate this free space concept. And, this was a quote I saw on a design school in Barcelona. Don't worry about people stealing your design work, worry about when they stop. So I really believe and subscribe to this kind of open source mentality of, if you have an idea and you believe it's good for the world, great. If someone else wants to do it, that it's a good sign that you have a good idea, and you'll always come up with new ones. So don't try and, hoard your own idea if it's something you believe is beneficial to the world. And we wound up doing free spaces in 17 different countries, 26 different times. And it was totally different wherever we went. The one in, San Francisco was very different than the one that was in Tokyo. It was very different than the one that was in the Philippines. So, that really became kind of my life, was to travel around and create these open spaces where people could come and share what they were passionate about. And then in 2016, I was invited to Greece. That was the kind of beginning of the European refugee crisis, and it was a complete disaster. And there was a wealthy philanthropist who had donated money to refugee causes with a large group on the island of Lesbos. And when he showed up and saw what was going on there, he was disgusted and said, I don't want to support these groups anymore. We're going to have to do it ourselves. And they were looking for someone who knew how to set up spaces in a creative way, but who hadn't gained the kind of bad habits of the refugee industry. And so I got invited there. I toured around about 50 different refugee camps in Greece, Turkey, Macedonia. It's now called New Macedonia. And this is what they were putting people in: tents inside of warehouses or tents in the field. And, you know, again, to be contrarian, to do something different than other people are doing, we decided to do something radical. And we asked the refugees, what kind of space would they like? How would they design their own space? And that's what we did. We put together, you know, an actual space, you know, or, you know, instead of tents, we put up sheetrock and doors with, you know, windows and beds and chairs, you know, places like, you know, you would like to sleep. You know, camping's fun, but not for, you know, months at a time, and certainly not in a building in a warehouse with screaming children and everything. So yeah, that's what we did. And, you know, we built this building, and this is what the outside of it looked like. Again, it's not an ideal situation that they were stuck in Greece, but by adding some color, by giving people this keyword again, agency, let them design and create their own spaces, we were able to make the most dignified space for migrants in Greece. And, you know, if you see this comparison, this is what the governments and the NGOs did on top, and this is what we did on the bottom. And what's crazy to me, and this is what kind of got me involved in this for now the last 4 years, is that we spent less than half per person to build this dignified living space compared to these, you know, tents. And that's really what made me, you know, have to keep sticking to this as my work. And that's led me to travel all over the world to learn about different refugee contexts, including, this is a screenshot from Bangladesh, which is where I think how we got connected. And you can see this is just a screenshot from Google Earth. This used to be a place that was just filled with trees. And then you can see on the left, that's what it transformed into, is the largest refugee camp in the world, which is called Kutupalong in Bangladesh. And it's 1.2 million people living in an extremely dense environment. And, you know, then I've also, as I said, you know, looked at post-natural disaster situations. This is the National Cathedral in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. And, you know, I really believe that society needs so many things to be kind of reimagined, but it's very difficult to do in New York or Paris. Like, things are pretty good. The pandemic has been an interesting time that people are kind of rethinking things. And again, it often takes a crisis in order to think differently, to make things more equitable for others, to look out for those who are most vulnerable. And so I really am encouraged in some ways that people are rethinking systems. And just to show, you know, a few images of Uganda, you know, Uganda is actually one of the best countries in the world for displaced people. One, they're allowed to, they have an open door policy where anyone who's from a country on this kind of list can come. Two, they're allowed to work. And three, they're allowed to move freely. And I truly believe that this is crucial and that more countries should embrace these policies, because, you know, if you can't work, then you're basically stuck being dependent on, you know, the government and the NGOs, you know, the nonprofits to support everything, including your meals, your food, your clothing, your toothpaste, you know, toilet, I mean, everything. And so I'm really encouraged by Uganda, and we've been working together to kind of build public spaces where people can gather. This is an amphitheater that we built. This was Women's Day earlier this year. I mean, it's just this, you know, celebration that people feel like they can't be seen, or that refugees feel kind of like not seen and not heard. And I'm just so excited about bringing public spaces into these refugee contexts. And again, this isn't really done. It's a, you know, it makes me an outlier to be asking people what they want instead of just, you know, assuming that I know. And yeah, so I guess that's kind of the themes of my work, is not just kind of doing things for people. It's evolved to kind of doing things with people. And now it's evolved even past that to kind of just hooking people up with resources because they know what they need better than anyone from the outside possibly could. And again, this is a radical concept in the, you know, humanitarian sector and in many different sectors, but people know what they need. And that's kind of the message that I've learned over these years, is to not show up somewhere and assume that you know what people need. But by creating space and offering space for people to create themselves, that you'll kind of get to see what they want. It manifests kind of in a very organic way that is custom tailored to where you're from. And people often say to me, like, oh, it sounds like teach a man to fish. And I say, no, I mean, kind of, but people already know how to fish. It's just that we've overfished their waters. We've polluted the streams, and so there's this other concept of capacity building, which I think is important, and it's better than just dependency of doing things for people. But the term I really like lately is called capacity recognition. Because capacity building implies that there's something lacking and you have to come in and show people how to do something. But really, they already have the capacity. They might just have it in a different sense than you're used to. So yeah, I guess that's my idea, is other people's ideas. And it's really again surprising to me that this is so unique, and it makes me kind of a world expert, because there's not many people who are doing it this way. But that's kind of some of the through lines of my work, is trusting that the best ideas will come not from me. I'm not from I'm only from one place, and I don't even know personally what to do in that place. But I've seen time and time again that if you can use culture to gather people, that collectively they can come up with the most equitable and best solution for each other.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because I've been to Kutupalong in Bangladesh. I think we met when I had my personal project crossing Turkey from the Syrian border all the way to Lesbos. We got introduced at that stage. And then in Bangladesh, we got in touch again. And the situation in Bangladesh, and my idea of going to the camp, which I did kind of illegally anyway, because I couldn't get authorizations from anyone. Got myself a fixer, and I used a forbidden military back road to get into certain areas where there was no surveillance. It was a very strange kind of a visit. But the idea was to try to figure out how can you bring Wi-Fi to the camp to allow them to do outsourced work that would generate income, maybe getting paid in some sort of a cryptocurrency that is convertible to the local currency. I can't quite recall what they use in Bangladesh. But the government actually had an edict stating that connectivity to the internet was forbidden. Right? So they were smuggling SIM cards, and you can buy them in the middle of the camp. It is obviously against the Bangladeshi law. So you have greater powers in play. And unfortunately, the interests are not aligned at all. The government has, at least certain segments of the government, to have an interest in making the lives of the refugees as miserable as possible so that they go away. And what happens in Uganda is truly unique, because they have a very enlightened legislation when it comes to accepting and fostering refugees. It's a little bit less enlightened in some other sectors, like gender options. I guess you're familiar with those. But the result of the refugee policy is that now you have lots of refugee entrepreneurs hiring Ugandans and giving them salaries and work that they would not have otherwise, because they're bringing those best practices from Sudan, from Somalia, the trading skills or the network that they developed over multiple generations in those countries. So Ugandans benefit from that. It's hard to say why. I'm not familiar with the history. I don't know if every single country in the region started having exactly the same policies, if they will kind of lift all the boats at the same time. I mean, what works in Uganda would not necessarily work in Kenya or other countries hosting refugees. But it's really great to have this benchmark and say, hey, there's the Ugandan case. Let's go there and have a look and try to understand how it can be adapted. But above all, it is a matter of saying, look, if you can at least keep powerful people away from meddling, from preventing the refugees from having the agency because it's in their interest to do so. And sadly, many of those refugee organizations, they are very jealous of the budget. Right? When you go to Kutupalong, it's so bizarre because there is a whole neighborhood that belongs to UNHCR, another one that belongs to the International Organization for Migration. And they all have their satellite communication systems. They all have their different suppliers. It's all segmented when, from a higher perspective, that's completely nonsensical. You just want to be as efficient as possible, but politics get on the way. Right? So getting things down to the local, to the micro, to the group level, as you're doing, saying, here's a space, gather your friends, try to figure out what you can do that is going to add value to the community, is first very difficult to fight. Zane, how can anyone from one of the large organizations saying it's a bad idea to improve the conditions for half the price? Right. So what you're doing is insidious in many ways, is revolutionary because it makes a huge amount of sense, and is really hard to find arguments against allowing you to do it. And some people will try. They will try to figure out, but this is not according to the policy and the protocol. And you just wiggle your way around because you're small and flexible, and you just find another way of generating value, preventing powerful people from retaining too much power. And this is just human nature. So I'm very, very glad to see the work you're doing to understand it a little bit better, because I did my TEDx on refugee connectivity in 2016. I believe that this is when we first got connected. And now, 4.5 years later, I finally understand what you're actually doing. And hopefully that's going to serve as an example to many teenagers and parents and speakers and volunteers who belong to the Wisdom Accelerator community. I do have one question, though, because we're already past your time. I don't know if you're in a hurry. The question is, how do you identify spaces like the one in San Francisco? You kind of go around and you spot that there's a warehouse that is abandoned, you get the phone number of the owner. I mean, you make it sound simple. It's anything but. How do you have that first, not step, but jump to get through the major hurdles at the very beginning to make it happen?
Yeah, it's let's see. I mean, the first one was the hardest, because we really had to convince the building owner. Then, since we've done it successfully, like in our first one, we did 119 events in our first 30 days. And it was in an area, Soma, which kind of was like a mid-market of San Francisco, which wasn't really happening that much on the real estate front. And so that's kind of the idea, is that and I never want to trick an owner. You want to have like a mutually beneficial relationship. There have been many different instances. And also it's really important to have fixers. Like you mentioned the term fixer. My whole life runs on fixers. That's someone who's from a place that you're showing up to that can be a translator, kind of a guide, let you know which places you want to avoid. And so it's really important to have local knowledge of like, what are the up and coming areas? And if you have the ability to bring people to an area where they aren't, that's valuable to the building owner. Like, for example, one of the places we did, our second one in San Francisco, the building owner, the neighbor, showed up and was like, what are you guys doing here? And we explained it, and he says, this is great. Here's $1,000. I'll give you $1,000 for every month you're here. Thanks for bringing people to the neighborhood. So, there's all sorts of different, I'm an urban explorer. I love like the Paris catacombs. Sometimes you need to as you mentioned, I also showed up to Kutupalong in an illegal way the first time, or an unofficial way, I guess I would call it. And yeah, this is the same thing with like abandoned buildings, pieces of land. There's always latent, assets and like empty real estate. Even in places like Tokyo, people said, oh yeah, maybe you could do that, there, but you could never do that in Tokyo. And yet we did. There was a building there that was going to be demolished. But it was going to take like 8 months to get all the permits and the drawings and everything. So we activated that space, and we made it so active that after 3 months, the owner said, you know what, I'm not going to knock this building down, but I want it back. I see the potential in it now. And so, you know, we lost our place after 3 months, but it's just to show that it's always possible to kind of, you know, and I always kind of like things that no one else wants, because you can always make something great out of something if you have that engagement, if you have a group of people who's interested in it, and you can always create value.
Yeah, there's a very famous abandoned building in Tokyo that is an architectural jewel, but it's not being used and it cannot be demolished, right? So it's just stuck there. And of course, it comes with the limitations of listed buildings and everything else. But you know what? Inside the building, yeah, it's listed, but there's some more flexibility. And I think we suffer from a lack of ideas and agency, innovation, as you described, because the one thing you can do, and that's something that I learned in Davos during the World Economic Forum, and Davos being a very small city, it's like 10,000 people. And you have the whole world and very powerful, influential people trying to rent space to showcase the brands and the new message and trying to find investment and partners. And you kind of just go to the town hall, you talk to the people, you have an open conversation saying, I would like to make teenagers wiser. I do believe that bringing them from all around the world to spend a week in Davos during the World Economic Forum is a way of making sure I'm attracting top talent, you know, in the teenagerhood sphere. I have lots of good friends who have super interesting lives, and they would benefit from having conversations with those teenagers and vice versa. And eventually, the solution was that all the accommodation in a radius of several miles, kilometers for all the others, is taken. You can go north, south, east, west, there's nothing. And if you find something, it's super expensive. So I went up. Now I managed to find this mountain hotel that has service with a cable car that stops at 4:30. So no one going to Davos for the World Economic Forum is going to stay in a mountain hotel, because in the night, that's when you have all the action, the cocktail parties and the networking. So that place was empty. And all of a sudden, I managed to find accommodation for 30 people 5 minutes from the city center, just by looking up instead of looking around. And it resonates a lot with what you did, like finding this place in San Francisco and just asking the question. Right? And what I did was I had a solution looking for a problem. And I managed to build the problems, like how to find accommodation in Davos during the business week of the year. And that's just one example. Another friend of mine who has a nonprofit, he doesn't have a lot of money, a lot of funding. He has a huge space. I think it's something like 10,000 square feet, 1,000 square meters in New York, in front of Pennsylvania Station, which he uses for free. And that, again, it's very similar to your model of digging a little bit deeper, lifting the stones and looking at what's squiggling down there. And in his case, it's just this mezzanine floor that had to be refurbished. And there was a stalemate. They just did not know what to do with that floor. And then he was like, can I have my nonprofit here while you guys are figuring it out? You don't have to paint the walls. You don't have to change the carpet. Or just, you know, bring some secondhand furniture. And he's been there for years in front of Penn Station, paying zero. Right? And there's so many opportunities like that. I think it's a mindset more than anything else preventing people from doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I turn down spaces. There's people who offer me spaces all over the world, but for one, I'm pretty focused on human displacement, you know, and human migration. But two, yeah, once you kind of establish yourself as someone who has ideas, that's what people are looking for. There's so much, latent assets around the world that are simply looking for activation and, as you called it, ideas. So yeah, it's something I never, thought about before, but then you try it and all of a sudden you become the world expert. So that was kind of my message. You don't necessarily have to follow what everyone else did. In fact, sometimes it's really great if you can make your own, because then you become the world expert. The world expert of one.
Well, you're an urban explorer, right? As you mentioned, you're just trying to figure out what's out there in front of everybody's noses that they cannot see because they're not looking with the right glasses.
Yeah, that was one of the projects. Like, this refugee camp that I'm staying in, or right on the edge of, is 62 years old.
Yeah.
And it's 130,000 people. So by age and by population, it's very much a city, but it's lacking certain things like post office, like public space, like urban planning, monumental art. And so that's kind of what we've been doing is, instead of one building, we've scaled to kind of the village and the city scale of how do we transform this space into a city. And that's this group Promise Hub set up a post office that now I can get Amazon directly to the refugee camp. Takes 2 weeks and it's a bit expensive, but for being here for 7 months, it's really great to to be able to get access to some products that I can't usually get here.
Very cool. And I'm one of the United Nations Smart Cities experts, right? So this is not a big fancy title, I'm just volunteering. But if you need any support at the UN level in Geneva, I'm literally next door. And maybe can get you to speak at one of their events. They're slowly reopening the office for e-commerce week next month. So if you'd like to share your story and ask for support, I'm very happy to facilitate.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, that's part of the message. And again, I saw a number that really scared me the other day from The Guardian, predicted that 1.2 billion people could be possibly displaced by 2050, mostly because of climate change. And that's a crazy number. Currently there's about 75 million displaced. So that's scaling up, and we already don't have enough resources. And the methodologies used to to manage or to support displaced people is already overstretched. And so to see that number multiply, we need new approaches. And I really think it comes down to cities. All European cities started out as camps. They were Russian or Roman forts that people just started to gather closer to have some safety, and then walls were built around them. And, it took some hundreds of years, but they become economic and cultural powerhouses like Paris and things. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do, is like, look at it that way. How do we accelerate this conditions by which people can live self-sufficiently? Because then they're not going to be dependent on, foreign budgets for their, survival and lack of suffering. But as you mentioned, a lot of times the policy is punishment. In a post-natural disaster world, if you have enough funding, you can build, Shangri-La, you can build palaces. But in a refugee context, if you build something that's too nice, one, you'll kind of offend the local people who might not have that much. That's what happened in Greece. Greece went through a really terrible economic downturn, and then they had the refugees showing up by the tens of thousands, and over 1 million actually passed through to Germany and other European states. So anyway, there's a lot of obstacles, but I truly believe that the kind of future is about setting up these kind of new cities, not camps, that can be both for nationals, locals of a country, and those who are forced to flee to it. So very much interested in the UN's approach and needing to radically change the way that it's done. Otherwise, it's gonna get a lot worse, and it actually is very scary to me.
Well, your approach is scientifically very well understood. It's almost like marketing A/B testing. Like A is the way it's done today. B is give them the money, guidelines, frameworks, and examples, and see what happens, right? If you manage to do that for half the price, it's very difficult for them to discuss the data. Like the big hurdle, the equivalent of approaching the warehouse owner in San Francisco is that letting them allow you to do that. And in places like Bangladesh, sadly, you can't have the internet, period. And they have some silly excuse saying, oh, maybe someone's going to learn how to make explosives with the internet. It's like they don't know where to get this information already. But they're not looking for solutions. They're just looking for alignments to their political purposes. So if you can find a way to make it impossible for them to justify rationally the decision for power play or whatever it is, you get into a marketing A/B sort of situation, and all of a sudden you're fighting with real life. You're fighting with the true potential.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for including me. I'm Mike Zuckerman on Facebook, and if anyone, or I think it's on Instagram, Mike.Zuckerman. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm really excited to engage with people who aren't traditional humanitarians, because I'm not, and we really need creativity and design and the youth to be interested in this work. And it's very exciting because, refugee camps are microcosms of society. It has every single aspect, from education to mental health to energy, waste management. I mean, every aspect of a city, of society, is present inside of these camps. But instead of being this legacy infrastructure that's already been built for hundreds of years, it's brand new. You start with these greenfield sites of just, and that's kind of what I've been witnessing here is, about 15,000 Congolese arrive to Uganda in February and March, and they get dropped off into a field with a couple of wood poles, a UNHCR tarp, a machete, and like a jerry can. And, so it's a blank, a clean slate to be able to, try things out. So, whatever you're interested in, it's applicable. And, I'm always happy to connect with people. So thank you for the opportunity to share some of my story today. And I'll be listening.